Fantastic audience. I understand that this is, if not the last day of classes, close to it. So I want to thank all of you for being here and making time in your busy schedules to hear a talk on such an unusual topic. I will assume that it's your passion for the topic of poultry breeding and not pizza. I'm an optimist like that. I want to start first and foremost by thanking Alex, thanking Leon as well, and certainly thanking Environmental Studies and Anthropology for bringing me here. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to having a conversation about this today and then maybe continuing it tomorrow. As Alex suggests, this is probably going to be a little bit of a challenging talk. It gets quite technical at various points, but I'm going to try to walk you through what I think is a pretty provocative and unusual set of connections. Connections that are, of course, referenced in the title and that you may have looked at with some incredulity about whether or not I could actually pull it off. So let's see. Can I put endocrinology and chicken breeding together? Part one, feeling meat. Hubert Goodale's archive at the American Philosophical Society is filled with odd birds. They pop up in unexpected corners, hiding between the brittle brown pages of Goodale's handwritten manuscripts. The birds are mostly in old photographs, though there is also a box of their feathers, and Goodale tended to tape still more feathers to notes and correspondences that are also spread throughout the archive. The feathers of dead birds, as you might imagine, are faded and lifeless, which is why I suppose I prefer the photographs, which allow the birds, for all their deadness, to still move in this archive. This is because the glue affixing them to the rough-hewn brown paper, where they were originally mounted in the poultry surgical operations folder, has long lost its grip, and with the slow passage of archival time, some birds have slipped out, sneaking into inappropriate folders, hiding like vagrants in the drafts of Goodale's later essays, articles with titles like Man's Biological Destiny and The Improvement of the Human Race. Goodale himself is sometimes present as a disembodied hand, posing the birds, his full personality looming just outside the frame, his flesh fleetingly caught within it. Goodale's writerly voice always intoned the sobriety of a serious man of science, tackling only big questions with insights from genetics. But the birds speak too, in their poses, postures, and even simple presences, against the somber profundity of Goodale's well-honed thought. No thought so vivid as their smoking blood, to quote Ted Hughes' poem about a different photograph of the dead. To regard these photographs might well dement such contradictory permanent horrors here smile from the single exposure and shoulder one's own body from its instant and heat. The photographs chronicle a series of experiments Goodale conducted on scores of chickens and ducks over the course of 2 decades, between roughly 1910 and 1930. In these experiments, Goodale conducted a series of surgical interventions on the birds to identify the role of the gonads and their secretions in the sexual development of fowl. More precisely, Goodale castrated male birds and grafted the resected ovaries of hens onto their abdomens, a process he termed feminization, and the birds, though cockerels, bear the markings and featherings of hens, if you look at the photographs carefully. Goodale conducted these experiments as a young man under the supervision of the leading lights of early 20th century genetics and biology. And the studies, in fact, remain his most widely cited research, folded into a series of grafting experiments, as they're called, by scientists in Europe and the United States that would become foundational to endocrinology and were arguably the earliest instances of experimental endocrinology. But Goodale himself was not a medical doctor, nor particularly interested in human physiology. After his poultry experiments, Goodale enjoyed preeminence as an influential livestock geneticist. His career stretched a half-century into the 1960s, and his contributions to animal science were so numerous and significant that his work was profiled in Life magazine in 1938, and that's Goodale himself. But because he focused mostly on the application of genetics to livestock breeding, he is seldom remembered in the annals of the history of science, a footnote at best. And this is a shame. Goodale was what I would call a consummate meat maker. His legacy as such has shaped countless bodies, both human and animal. Goodale is part of the ligature, or perhaps ligaments, that knit the industrial ecology of meat making to the history of the human life sciences and how human life is governed. My current book project asks how the history of meat making relates to what I call the history of political desires, particularly as desires condition how we understand the basic and frequently naturalized qualifications of life through gender, race, and sexuality. It asks not only how meat making has been transformed, but also how, in transforming the making of meat, the substance of life has been transformed, and with it, our desires for life and the world that would house it. This talk offers an overview of that history that I expand upon in the book, but it also complicates it with the microhistory of one peculiar meat maker in Goodale. I am personally seduced by Hubert Goodale as a historical subject precisely because of the uncanny and often painful connections he knits across the boundaries of species. But first, let me define the two key terms upon which these claims are built. First, by meat making, I am being glib and catchy. I mean the historical processes by which humans have turned the substance of animal bodies into their food. This definition encompasses not only the flesh conventionally denominated, if massified as meat, but also a variety of other substances such as tallow, eggs, cheese, lard, that are not conventionally understood as meat, but as Carol Adams would argue, are currently and ubiquitously consumed as adjacent feminized proteins. In deep historical and global context, the history of meat making has encompassed a variety of strategies and technologies, including low-intensity husbandry, as well as hunting, fishing, and trapping. Because my focus is on the North American continent in the last 3 centuries, I am primarily interested in how the substances of 3 specific domesticated animals, cattle, swine, and chickens, have become, through intensive breeding and raising, the foundation of modern Western diets, displacing entirely those other modes of provision and indeed radically remaking the political ecology of the North American continent and increasingly the planet. This is a simple definition, perhaps overly simple, but it is also dangerous. Because meat is now common, we may be easily tempted to think that its current mode of provision is merely an intensified form of earlier modes. As you will see, I think the simplicity of meat making as a world-making process belies the profundity of this transformation, how it constantly remakes the human in the name of sustaining the human. It is then not only how meat making has depended upon the intensification of life, but quite literally life's flaying. The second definition is more complicated and necessarily abstract. By political desires, I mean structures of feeling that relate our local material and banal everyday experiences, the location of what we might term our practical agency, to use Lauren Berlant's term, to the sometimes inhumanly vast objects that absorb and rework those practical agencies as they are articulated as, through, and within the political, which is to say what we desire from the world and what we desire the world to be. Despite the dulcet tones of reason and sobriety that may temper or fail to temper political debate, and certainly despite the general liberal faith and reason debate as the foundation of good democratic governance, politics is structured by desire wherever it is concerned with temporal and social scales that exceed individual experience or action. Whether we invest political acts with hope or fear, we aim to transform more than we can immediately see or hold, be it other people, institutions, communities, nations, or the world. And the narratives of these transformations are interwoven not just with logical propositions and empirical findings, but with emotions, affect, attachment, identification, and fantasy. Feminist and queer theorizations of the political have endeavored to unravel the liberal tradition's conventional parceling of the public, the rational, and the masculine, above the private, the sentimental, and the feminine, an insight historians of science and technology use to question the image of the scientist, expert, or technocrat as governed only by cold rationality, devoid of affective investments, much less gendered assumptions about the world they examine. The broader sweep of my book tells the story of how humans, in the service of making meat, have remade reproduction for all creatures, including themselves. Livestock bodies, in my account, are vital nodes in a vast industrial ecology that has encompassed and intertwined cows, pigs, chickens, horses, and sheep, but also humans. And within this economy, livestock acted as pivotal metabolic actors in rapidly reconsolidating chains of energy conversion, transforming at first photosynthesized energy and eventually energy from stored carbon into calories for human consumption. How efficiently animals can perform this conversion is partially a function of their genetic constitution, meaning that as the volume in meat increased and the margins decreased, animal agriculture operators have increasingly focused on honing the metabolic productivity of some animals, we'll call them feeders, as well as the ability of other animals, we'll call them breeders, to reliably reproduce productive offspring. Especially since the advent of biosemiotics and genetics, this latter aspect has tended to reposition livestock as what we might term lively capital, capable of storing and reproducing value apart from their exchange value as meat commodities or sources of labor energy. Indeed, livestock have become experimental signal boxes through which proprietary information is coded, decoded, and recoded as it is transmitted across space and time, giving a kind of proof of concept to generalized theories of how value can be inherited and how such theories can be practically applied. Thus, in application, livestock have also been radically opened to bioscientific inquiry in ways that humans have not, both because of the absence of juridically imposed limits, but also because of the faster reproductive cycles common to chickens, swine, and cattle, and because of the cheapness and ubiquity of their bodies, that is, kind of industrial surplus. A host of reproductive technologies now regularly applied to humans had their initial deployments and technical optimization in the context of livestock breeding, and that includes artificial insemination, in vitro fertilization, hormonal treatments, gene editing, and even cloning. The sum of these impulses, the use of livestock reproduction as a field site to test both genetic theories and the mechanics of sex, has meant that livestock bodies are the most intensively and routinely engineered megafauna on Earth, a fact that is registered in the unusual history of the term genetic engineering itself. Its earliest recorded public utterance, the historian Kevin Davies recounts in Editing Humanity, was at the 1932 Sixth International Congress of Genetics during the presentation of a paper titled Genetical Engineering. The paper concerned work at an experimental livestock breeding farm financed by Rockefeller money called Mount Hope Farm in Williamstown, Massachusetts. And over a span of a few decades, geneticists at that farm had, in their words, genetically engineered a particularly fine stud bull through a protocol informed by population genetics that would become termed index breeding. Davies suggests the paper and its catchy coinage was mostly overlooked at the time. At the conference, attention was instead focused on what he terms the rock stars of the era, Thomas Hunt Morgan and his colleagues from the famous fly room. If you've heard of fruit fly genetic experiments, that's Thomas Hunt Morgan. He would go on to win the Nobel Prize in 1933. Certainly overlooked in 1932, and in fact by Davies himself today, was that the livestock geneticist who coined genetical engineering had also, only 2 decades before, actually co-authored a paper with Morgan called Sex-Linked Inheritance in Poultry, a paper that canvassed the sex mechanisms of 3 species, fowl, human, and Drosophila, or fruit flies. Hunt's co-author, none other than the experimental grafter himself, Hubert Goodale. Part 2, the world meat made. The emergence of cheap meat as a dietary staple in affluent industrialized societies is a development of world historical significance. I don't want to leave it at the economic and environmental consequences of cheap meat, but it is nevertheless a pretty good place to start. Cheap meat depends on a globalized system in which livestock are fattened with feed grains, primarily soy and corn, grown in petrochemical-laden monocultures. The system, lauded for its productivity, is only productive if one uses selective accounting. In the US, for example, it takes more than 10 calories of energy, sometimes as much as 15 to 20, much of it from stored carbon, to produce 1 calorie of edible food. And that ratio has increased dramatically over the past 2 centuries. Meanwhile, the well-documented results are an environmental catastrophe. The feed-to-meat complex brings polluted groundwater, deforestation, and habitat destruction, as well as zoonotic spillover events. Because of the carbon intensity of petrochemical inputs and the methane emissions from cattle, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization now estimates that livestock account for at least 18% of humanity's current total greenhouse gas emissions, although other environmental scientists argue that this is probably an underestimate because it does not account for the loss of carbon sequestration capacity wrought by deforestation. For historians, however, the surge in interest in meat's contemporary environmental cost has sparked a reevaluation of meat's contribution to the political, economic, and environmental development of the American nation state. Unencumbered by Southern and Democratic opposition during the Civil War and Reconstruction periods, Republicans enacted a sweeping set of laws that facilitated rapid agricultural expansion into Western territories. When combined with the continued presence of US military forces in the West, this legislation laid the groundwork for the conversion of millions of acres of land into settled agriculture and ranges. The production of staple commodities were central to this violent transition, but livestock production was simply the most efficient and lucrative means to extract value from the West. Certainly the most ubiquitous, since virtually all farms housed some form of livestock. Cattle grazed on Western lands traveled east by rail to finishing farms in the Corn Belt, where alongside hogs, they were fattened on dent corn. Fattening farms in the Corn Belt, in fact, intermingled with dairy farms, with the latter regularly offloading the male offspring of continually pregnant dairy cows to the former. And just as this value chain tightened links between animal flesh and value, railroads and refrigeration also expanded what we would term milk sheds of urban centers, generating regional and eventually national and global markets in dairy products. While beef was king and barreled pork a regular dietary staple in the 19th century, chicken was largely peripheral to the American diet until the second half of the 20th century. People ate eggs and they kept chickens to lay them. Those chickens mostly lived on what they could peck in the yard. If people ate chicken meat, it usually came from a hen who was no longer a productive egg layer, a dynamic that gave many people the impression that chicken meat was always tough and leathery. The dual-use function of poultry, as both egg and meat, had historically been a barrier to capital-intensified production. Productive egg-laying chickens tended to have poor feed-to-weight conversion ratios, and chicken meat was what became of the chicken's body only after reproductive labor had been fully exploited and extracted. It made little business sense then to raise egg-laying chickens for meat, and that in turn introduced path dependencies in breeding lines. Chicken breeding was institutionally disorganized in comparison to cattle and swine, and even by the late 19th century, even those few breed associations only bred chickens selected for laying and aesthetics. But egg economies were also highly localized and capital barriers to market entry extremely low. As a result, there were no good reasons for farmers to invest in larger flocks. Who would buy all the eggs? Nearly everyone who wanted to own an egg-laying chicken could afford to own one, and the perishability of eggs limited potential buyers to only a small pool of consumers. By the early 20th century, however, several factors began to erode this dynamic. First, improvements in transportation and refrigeration technology expanded potential egg sheds and gave farmers access as well to a burgeoning pool of urban consumers forbidden to keep chickens by law. With the support of the USDA and land-grant colleges, chicken breeders also began to systematically disaggregate layers from meat birds, what would become known as broilers. Much of this work was initially organized through pure and standard breeding protocols that emphasized ancestral blood and phenotype, but chicken biology was extremely well suited to the objectives of applied geneticists. Laying could be quantified and measured, and shorter Gallian reproductive cycles ensured that roosters had vastly more offspring than bulls and boars. And as a result, chickens were an ideal test case for the insights of population genetics. Operationalized was what would be called, as we've said, index breeding. At scale, index breeding generated remarkable productivity gains in egg laying, and this in turn offered a market opportunity for anyone willing to capitalize. Most farmers were not. Poultry labor had long been gendered feminine, and many farmers considered income from it marginal supplement, so-called egg money, unrelated to the main profit centers of their farms. Many farmers systematically undercapitalized what might have been a profitable venture as a result. The final nail in the coffin then of those local egg economies came with the spectacular growth of chain groceries beginning in the 1920s and accelerating after World War II, which radically simplified distribution networks. As egg laying became more intensive, the basic dynamics of the industry also shifted towards high volume, low margin production. Under these conditions, operations had enormous incentive to squeeze marginal revenue and cost reductions that when scaled across tens or thousands of birds could mean big money. So take our so-called male chick problem. I don't know if you've heard about this, but in terms of reproductive labor, roosters are thrifty and productive. You only need one rooster for your flock. Under normal conditions, that single rooster fertilizes the eggs of hundreds and even thousands of hens. And this means that chicken breeding operations tended to have among the most skewed sex ratios of any livestock animals, with nearly all male offspring treated as surplus. But unlike steers and barrows, male chicks cannot be profitably raised for meat. And as a result, most egg farms cull male chicks as soon as they are able to identify them. With tight margins, egg farmers wanted to find ways to quickly and reliably identify male chicks that were physiologically difficult to distinguish from females. Without guidance or intervention, an egg farmer might wastefully feed a male chick for days or weeks before detecting its sex, only to then have to unprofitably kill it. A single chick, of course, consumed only a minuscule amount of feed. But if we're talking tens of thousands of chicks moving through operations, costs quickly mounted, improving these tight margins has then to a great extent mobilized much of the science of Gallian sex differentiation, including the foundational work of the poultry geneticist Masashi Kiyoshi. Masashi both developed a common chicken sexing technique that was then exported to the United States in the 1950s and 1960s, but as crucially, he bred a line of layers that matured more quickly and were more starkly sex differentiated than conventional breeds. And so thinking this through, what Masashi is doing, as Goodale would also attempt to do, he was unlocking the genetic mechanisms of Gallian sex development precisely to engineer birds that fit more perfectly into the industrial ecology of high volume, low margin meat making. Part 3, the meat. Hubert Goodale's Feminized Cockerels. So Goodale was far from alone in favoring surgical grafting as an experimental method to unlock the secrets of sex development, gonads, and their secretions. The group of anatomists, zoologists, biologists, and medical doctors who would eventually coalesce by mid-century in the field of endocrinology tended to emphasize glands and hormones as the primary mechanism for human sexual development. But this claim depended on the extensive use of animal bodies as objects of experimental intervention. Thus, Eugen Steinack, Knut Sand, Karl Mohr, Alejandro Lipschutz, Lincoln Dahm, and Masashi, and many others made experimental grafts using the gonads of vertebrate megafauna, slicing ovaries and testes from and sometimes between chickens, ducks, quails, guinea pigs, rats, rabbits, sheep, goats, cattle, and eventually humans. Since glandular secretions seem to play a central role in the development of secondary sex characteristics, maturation, and aging many of these features identified hormones as essences with uniquely vitalizing effects, a belief that attracted sensational and sometimes unsavory actors. For example, the French surgeon Sergei Voronov famously grafted the tissue from monkey gonads onto men, promising them rejuvenating effects, while the Kansan quack John Romulus Brinkley was sued for wrongful death in more than a dozen cases when his patients died on the table following procedures to graft goat testicles as a cure for impotence. Don't go to that doctor. As Chandak Sengupta notes, by localizing vitality itself in a distillable hormonal essence, early endocrinology immediately lent itself to a particular kind of commercialization and medical application. But as transgender studies scholars such as Kaji Amin and Jules Gill Peterson note, inquiries into the sexual plasticity of organisms was foundational not just to the eventual development of gendered medicine for transgender people in the second half of the 20th century, but also investigations into intersex, hermaphrodite, intergrade, and mosaic individuals, both human and animal, helped to formulate medical notions of normal sex and gender. Such notions of sexual normalcy were in turn highly racialized and articulated within explicitly eugenic institutions. Animals played a crucial role in eugenic discourses, as I have argued elsewhere, not simply because livestock bodies and reproductive styles opened promising experimental approaches, but also because agricultural improvement through selection was the most ubiquitous and ready-at-hand way to illustrate the efficiency of applied genetics. And yet, human medical practices were a trailing interest for Goodale, as I've mentioned, who remained throughout his career far more interested in the particularities and peculiarities of Gallian sex and how it interfaced with profit and commerce. Goodale was born in Troy, New Hampshire in 1879. He was the son of a preacher, and he studied at Trinity College in Connecticut. He worked briefly as a chicken farmer before pursuing a doctorate in biology from Columbia University. As a doctoral student, Goodale worked as a research assistant to the famed biologist, geneticist, and dean of American eugenics, Charles B. Davenport. Davenport directed the Station for Experimental Evolution at Carnegie Institute's laboratory at Cold Spring Harbor, and in 1910, he founded the Eugenic Records Office there. Goodale joined Davenport at Cold Spring Harbor in 1911, tasked with taking charge of the laboratory's work on poultry genetics, which Davenport also had an interest in. It was perhaps Goodale's brief stint as a chicken farmer that convinced Davenport of his value. But Goodale stayed only for 2 years, and his association with Davenport was nevertheless formative and enduring. Davenport would later help Goodale publish his articles, providing feedback and connections. And because of his association with Davenport, Goodale had sufficient notoriety that his work was read and cited by the leading figures in American genetics, including individuals like Alexander Sturtevant, Raymond Pearl, and of course, Thomas Hunt Morgan, the Nobel laureate. But unlike those luminaries, Goodale's focus remained unusually practical. When Goodale completed his degree from Columbia in 1913, he departed Cold Spring Harbor for a position with the University of Massachusetts Agricultural Experiment Station in Amherst. Goodale's dissertation had concerned the biology of salamanders, but his focus at Cold Spring Harbor and then at Amherst was consumed by the problem of Galline reproduction. That focus first led Goodale into research on the interactions between sex and the heritability of traits in chickens, a topic on which he published several articles, including the paper with Morgan, Sex-Linked Inheritance in Poultry. These underlying research questions launched Goodale into an investigation into the biological mechanisms of sex development, which would become experimental endocrinology. Indeed, inspired by the work of the German Eugen Steinach, who had been grafting rat ovaries onto the bodies of live male rats in 1912, Goodale began to experimentally chart the effects of castration on the secondary sex characteristics of chickens and ducks. Morgan's interest in avian sex-linked inheritance was primarily theoretical, but Goodale had an unmistakable practical trajectory. He was determined to decipher not only which avian traits were sex-linked, but also whether and how avian secondary sex characteristics were shaped by inheritance. His interest there related to his opinion that egg laying was badly misunderstood by farmers, since it was, from Goodale's perspective, not a singular secondary sex characteristic, but actually a composite of physiological and behavioral traits, some primary sex characteristics, some secondary sex characteristics, and some entirely unrelated somatic characteristics. Goodale would go on to specify that traits such as frequency and regularity of ovulation, rate of sexual maturation, and broodiness, I'll talk more about that in a moment, all impacted egg productivity. Farmers tended to ignore this, presuming that the most feminine hens, defined as those with the most visibly distinguished female secondary sex characteristics, would also be the best egg layers. But egg production records failed to support this belief. Goodale's ambition then was to create a composite metric of egg laying that captured its complexity, but improving egg laying according to such a metric would in turn require systematically disaggregating its component pieces, some of which were sex-linked, others were not, and some of which could be amenable to selective breeding, but others not. Disaggregation, Goodale quickly recognized, would need to be quite literal. He needed an experimental approach that compared chicken bodies arranged according to a mosaic of sexed possibilities that did not appear in nature. Goodale sought first to make a systematic examination of the long-term effects of castration on chickens and ducks, examinations that he eventually published in a short book called Gonadectomy in relation to secondary sex characteristics of some domestic birds. Castrated male birds were, of course, rare, but not unheard of on American farms. Although it took care and skill, farmers sometimes castrated surplus male birds because capons tended to be fatter and larger than roosters, and their meat was generally considered more tender. But as Goodale noted, experiences with capons had generated little useful knowledge about their sex development. As meat animals, they rarely lived very long, and this meant that there was no reliable information about the physiological changes that were permanent, which were the results of castration, and which were only temporary. Similarly, there was no commercial reason to castrate female birds, and the result was that there were very few documented instances of it at all. Goodale's first experiments were directed then at providing data to test the conventional beliefs that the removal of sex organs was linked to permanent physiological changes in fowl. He concluded that the castration of male birds did indeed make them grow fatter and larger, that it altered their combs and head ornaments, but that it had little impact on their feathers, vocalization, and behavior, with the exception of brooding behavior, which had actually increased. By contrast, Goodale found that castration dramatically affected all of these things in hens, rendering, in his general scheme, capons and castrated hens both physiologically and behaviorally similar to roosters. Goodale's working theory at this point was that sex secretions of the testes inhibited or turned off sex development, and thus capons remained in a state of continuous physiological development. They continued to grow, that was why they grew so large and fat, and never developed a fully mature comb. To test this idea, Goodale continued to follow the trail blazed by Steinach. In the next phase of the experiment, Goodale grafted the ovaries of hens onto castrated juvenile males. The procedure was primitive if effective, although many of Goodale's roosters died in the process. Goodale resected live ovaries from a pullet of the same age as the cockerel. Then he anesthetized a cockerel with ether, made 2 incisions in the abdomen to remove its testes, cut the ovaries into pieces, and dropped the pieces into the cavities without sutures. Many of the cockerels, as I mentioned, did not survive or died in the following weeks. But Goodale reported that those cockerels that did survive to maturity were noticeably different than capons. They shared the larger size and smaller combs of the capon, but their plumage was, in Goodale's terms, fully feminized. Indeed, Goodale reported that he was careless with his first experimental graft and had failed to track it when he returned it to the flock. As a result, he initially mistook it for a castrated female, and he was confounded by the result that he, quote, thought that some mistake had been made in banding the chick or recording the number, but none could be found. He eventually confirmed the presence of the incision marks on its abdomen, but otherwise Goodale contended that the cockerel was, by appearance, entirely indistinguishable from a hen. Quote, the bird was shown to several experienced poultrymen without knowledge of the history of the caw, and they all pronounced it a female. Goodale interpreted the results of these later grafts as producing 2 distinct types of feminized cockerels. One, like the first graph, visibly was indistinguishable from a hen, while the second type had some feminine markings but retained masculine coloring and feather length. Given the modification in appearance, Goodale was eager to see if castration and grafting also modified behavior. And on this front, Goodale was disappointed. At maturity, the first grafted cockerel still crowed like a rooster, which hens rarely did. It exhibited no interest in brooding, which enticed most hens even when they were not laying. And most significantly for Goodale, the cockerel, quote, was also observed treading the hens. It is unusual for a hen to tread another, even in the absence of the male mating behavior. The feminized cockerels sometimes crow, but ordinarily they do not, Goodale wrote, nor do they exhibit much of the byplay of the normal cock, but they approach the females with every evidence of desire and go through all phases of copulation. In fact, Goodale suggested that, quote, the presence of ovarian tissue in the body of a male should accentuate the sexual behavior of the male. But while the changes in plumage seem to divide evenly by type, Goodale could not come up with an easy schema for the behavioral patterns he was observing. These results, however, also complicated Goodale's initial theory that sex secretions from testes. Goodale still contended that the secretions of the testes affect the extent of growth, and that the ovary, on the other hand, not only furnishes substances that determine the amount of growth, but also substances that determine what sort of growth takes place. Goodale still adhered to the position that the primary sex characteristic was the sex organ and their secretions, but his birds had complicated what he could conclude beyond this. To begin with, Goodale noted that some sex characteristics functioned entirely independent of sex organs, and in ways that made it perilous to distinguish secondary sex characteristics, defined again by Goodale as the effects of the secretions of sex organs, from ordinary somatic characteristics. Goodale illustrated this with reference to spurs. And this is a little bit complicated and technical, but castrating a hen would cause her to grow spurs, but grafting an ovary onto a cockerel would not inhibit him from growing spurs. And so from Goodale's perspective, spur growth was a characteristic that was controlled by sex secretions in hens, and therefore constituted a secondary sex characteristic for hens, but that was not controlled by sex secretions in roosters, and therefore was not a secondary sex characteristic for roosters. This finding seemed boldly counterintuitive, since spurs were visually identified as a key form of sexual difference between hens and roosters. Similarly, Goodale noted, quote, females from which the ovary has been removed are neutral in sexual behavior, but one of the most astonishing things about castrated males with implanted ovaries is that they exhibit the sexual behavior of the male only. Goodale found this particularly surprising, given that capons, he noted, tended to adopt the feminine behavior of broodiness. In other words, according to Goodale, sex secretions of the ovaries seem to be producing the same behavior in the cockerels that the sex secretions of the testes produced, which, while it was a total absence of secretions that produced broodiness in the capons. To explain all of this, Goodale admitted that sex secretions were likely far more complex than he had initially theorized, but also that these complex responses to sex secretions were due to the differences in the substratum on which the secretions act, which is to say, the genetic constitution of the birds. That is, Goodale insisted that the underlying genetic differences among the chickens might help to explain how different Gallian bodies responded to different sex secretions. In the case of spurs, for example, he posited the presence of spurs in the otherwise normal female may be due to the greater growth possibilities in the spurs of spurred races, and this view is supported by the failure of implanted ovaries to suppress spur development in the feminized males. The genetic composition of Gallian populations conditioned how chicken bodies were sexed, which meant in turn that knowing things about chicken sex could not be separated from the reality that Gallian populations were assembled, governed, and reproduced by human breeders. Or to pull from Goodale's later essay, the application of artificial selection to chicken populations meant that chicken sex could be and would be genetically engineered. This apparent malleability led Goodale to two strikingly non-essentialist conclusions about the nature and function of sex in chickens as in humans. First, Goodale cautioned that secondary sex characteristics might be loosely correlated but not causally related to primary sex organs. This led to a variety of extremely gratuitous confusions, in his terms, in which breeders might presume that reproductive function of an individual on the basis of striking or accentuated secondary sex characteristics, but, quote, such characters are not the value as an index of the masculinity or femininity of either themselves or the individuals that bear them. Second, secondary sex characteristics might only be partially causally shaped by sex secretions, which meant that one needed to conceptually allow for, quote, a series of secondary sex intergrades or secondary sex mosaics ranging from birds that are comparatively little feminized to those that have exhibited very few male characters. Here, Goodale circled back to his prior point about the genetic composition of the population. The degree to which a chicken expressed a secondary sex characteristic could depend both on its inherited traits and its exposure to sex secretions, a realization that reaffirmed that sex could be governed by modifying the genetic composition of the population. Oops. Part 4, last part, egg production and schizophrenia. So Goodale continued to conduct his grafting experiments for more than a decade. When he took the job at Amherst, he did so on the condition that he be afforded ample time and lab space to continue his experiments. He stayed at Amherst for nearly a decade before taking a job as the chief geneticist at Mount Hope Farm in Williamstown, Massachusetts in 1922. It was not, to understate the matter, a hardship posting. Rather, the farm was a 1,400-acre country estate for Colonel Ezra Parmalee Prentice and his wife, Alta Rockefeller Prentice, the daughter of the world's richest man at the time, John D. Rockefeller. Its centerpiece was a 72-room country house called Elm Tree House, still exists in Williamstown, and Goodale himself was given a stately home in town next to Williams College. Prentice, an attorney by profession, also styled himself a gentleman farmer. And so while it was a country home, it was also a working farm, an experimental dairy and poultry breeding farm to be precise. Although Prentice had a great many theories about animal breeding and genetics, he trusted Goodale to manage the technicalities and day-to-day operations of his breeding operation. Goodale insisted on continuing his grafting experiments, although he no longer had time to publish articles about it. Prentice had little patience for it, and he told Goodale so. Mount Hope was a farm, not a laboratory, Prentice maintained. And that meant that theoretical insights on the nature of sex were all good and fine, but they were only deserving of investment if they could be applied to the problems of farming. Prentice was perhaps a bit obtuse on the issue. Goodale's underlying interest in sex expression in chickens was partially related, in fact, to the male chick problem I've already mentioned. It was also partially related to his larger work on quantifying egg laying that was so important to Prentice. The theoretical understanding of sex expression primed Goodale to be suspicious of the conflation of genotype and phenotype. After all, Goodale's insights about the indeterminate link between the primary and secondary sex characteristics was essentially that if one wanted to measure reproductive capacity, one could not merely measure a correlated characteristic and call it a day. Rather, one had to measure the primary characteristic itself. Goodale lent this insight to his work at Mount Hope to the end that thoroughly satisfied Prentice. Index breeding was premised on the idea that one could quantify the egg-laying capacities of a rooster's offspring through progeny testing and then only breed from the highest performing roosters. Index breeding reversed what we might say is the usual temporality of breeding. Pure breeders look to an animal's past, that is to say their ancestry, to make conjectures about their future. This resulted, according to Goodale and Prentice both, as a disastrous fixation on phenotype as they were organized in breeds at the expense of a proper examination of genotype as it could be gleaned from an animal's offspring. Arguably, Goodale's insights about index breeding were already implicit in the approach he took to sex development. Naturalized categories such as breed, species, race, and sex were not singular, but were actually multiple and dynamic clusters of characteristics. Goodale's experimental curiosity about the solidity or permanence of any of these categories made his research precocious and untimely in its milieu, but it also left an outsized impression on many of his contemporaries. Goodale's accounts of his feminized cockerels were widely read, and they remain one of the key sets of experiments that defined experimental endocrinology in its earliest period, a touchstone reference for scholars interested in both the heritability and malleability of sex characteristics, and a vivid illustration of how to disaggregate all the fleshy bits that hide under the sign of a unitary and undifferentiated sex. It's no coincidence, then, that Milton Diamond, in his famous 1965 critique of John Money, the father of gender medicine, that Milton Diamond would credit Goodale with offering the first experimental demonstration of a framework that saw sex as shaped by both genetics and hormones. And this is a really key text if you're not familiar with it. It's the major critique of John Money. In this sense, Goodale's work to refashion chicken sex, which was in turn propelled by the imperatives of meat making, haunts later theorizations of human sexual development. Goodale's feminized cockerels always hiding between the pages in the history of sexual science. Goodale's approach to these categories led him in unusual personal directions. Steeped in the influence of Charles Davenport, it's hardly surprising that Goodale was also an enthusiastic eugenicist who presented his work on poultry genetics at a major eugenics conference. And yet he situated both temporal futurity and malleability at the heart of what he saw as a scientifically informed eugenics. So for example, he wrote to the prominent eugenicist Paul Papineau that, as with his critique of pure breeding, it made no sense to search for pure bloodlines and racial essences. What one needed to do was gauge who in society was already producing excellent offspring according to quantifiable metrics, and then to encourage them to reproduce even more. Along these lines, Goodale drafted a scoring plan for human fathers based loosely on his poultry and dairy index breeding and sent it to Papineau. I don't know if Papineau ever did anything with it. Goodale constantly invoked the lesson of animal and plant breeding as a guide for human reproductive governance. He would write in the journal Science, the human species is subject to biological laws that differ in no essential respect from the laws that govern animal and plant life. Surely what has been accomplished with animals and plants can be repeated with men. The governance of animal reproduction, poultry and dairy, was the constant reference points for the world that Goodale desired. And yet, as I am arguing, the thread connects always in both directions. Early in his career, Goodale had dug deeper into the concept of broodiness and inquired about its potential heritability. Broodiness is the perceived desire of a hen to incubate a clutch of eggs, and it manifests in distressed behavior if the hen is prevented from sitting on her eggs. Poultry farmers are quite ambivalent about broodiness. On the one hand, broody hens were assumed to be more fertile than those that were not. On the other hand, distressed behavior could delay egg laying and harm production. Goodale observed that farmers tended to select against broodiness because the delays outweighed and obscured improved fertility, and this in turn seemed to be a form of artificial selection that in nature might have been dysgenic for the chickens. Still, Goodale seemed fascinated by the subjective and behavioral elements of the characteristic. Could it be that chickens were genetically predisposed to what seemed from outward appearances to be a kind of emotional response or breakdown? Goodale co-authored one paper on the potential genetic influences of broodiness in 1918, and then he shelved the topic for more than a decade. Still in the 1930s, he returned to the problem, his interest renewed and at first almost maniacally invested. During my archival work on Goodale's papers in the American Philosophical Society, I came upon a series of drafts of an unfinished paper in Goodale's hands. Dated to the mid-1930s, there are perhaps a half dozen or more drafts though they begin and end abruptly with inconsistent and confounding pagination on unusual paper, all of it in Goodale's indecipherable handwriting. But they all bear the memorable title, Egg Production and Schizophrenia. The paper was never finished, but its broad outlines were clear. Goodale intended to use the genetics of schizophrenia as a model to understand and regulate broodiness in hens. I cannot speculate how this process unraveled, but I know that he started and restarted the paper again and again, never quite managing to articulate how or why human mental illness and chicken distress went together. But they were paired in his mind somehow, and indelibly so. In his archive, the series of papers immediately appears before a great silence of several years, during which his letters and careful record keeping simply halted. Later, in the 1940s, he corresponded with psychiatrists on the topic of the genetics of schizophrenia, and even wrote, but did not publish, a more polished and cogent analysis of it, but it didn't involve the chickens. When I asked the archivists at the American Philosophical Society what had transpired in those long years of silence, they said they were not certain, but that they had believed, based on a few of his personal letters held at the University of Massachusetts, that they know what event had inserted the caesura in Goodale's archival body, splitting and flaying it. For a time, they said, Hubert Goodale had been institutionalized.
So as people gather some thoughts and questions, I can lead us off. So I love this. This is classic Gabe to me, and it's also a recognizable move that I find myself making a lot when I'm trying to make claims that we don't actually understand the nature of the society that we live in, and or perhaps even the nature of the times we live in. I like to think about the profoundly thin line between human and animals, despite the chatter that we are kind of scientifically and rationally controlling animals. I'm struck by the fact that there are many more times the published knowledge on animal nutrition than there is human nutrition. That our society funds far more research into animal nutrition than it does human nutrition. I'm also struck by how many different medicines and ways of knowing the human body medically were first started with animals. And you're, of course, thinking along those lines here, the degree to which experimental testing, transformation of sexuality in animals transforms human beings. But I guess I want to just ask you openly, like, does that bother you? Does that thin kind of move between human and animal bother you? And if so, or if not, why does it seem to bother so many others, right? If I want to kind of shock a crowd, I can say that actually we can see that like everything that seems to be done to animals in industrial history and so forth very quickly gets transposed onto human beings. And yeah, I just want to hear how you think about that.
I mean, I have to say that, well, I don't know if I don't know what it necessarily would mean for it to bother me. But we'd have to talk about what that matter, you know, what that means in its particulars. I will say that like that fundamental suspicion that whatever it is that we do to animals in the interests of this vast industrial ecology will at some point probably come to be done to humans, which I think is largely an accurate generalization, is one that drives my investment in the topic. And it certainly is the case that I don't think that we fully comprehend the full profundity of the transformation of the food system in the past 2 centuries for precisely this reason. I think it's mind-boggling to consider that transformation in terms of an experiment in reproduction, which is in some senses an intensification of the management of reproduction for many thousands of years, those processes we call domestication. But in other respects, there's a fundamental departure from it. And the modes of governance are so radically different and so much more vast in scale that I don't think we really can fully sort of like glimpse the outbound, I would say, cultural trajectories of it. One way of putting this is that I would say we live in a meat ecology, and that our culture bears all of the impressions of that in ways that we don't recognize, that we don't see, that we don't necessarily know. I always suspect this, but if aliens came and studied human society, they would see our relationship to livestock animals as perhaps the most fundamental, informing how we come to ideas about value, how we qualify what it means to be living, what it means to live well. I think these are fundamental in some senses to what I would say are our most basic moral faculties. And it is why I continue in that trajectory. So does it bother me? I suppose it has to bother one, doesn't it? It has to bother one, but also don't want to become consumed by it. As Cora Diamond would say of Elizabeth Costello, we want to avoid that. There's a lot in this presentation to digest, so if you don't have an immediate question, it's understandable.
As folks gather some thoughts, I'll also say that, you know, one of the pieces in the public sphere that you've been most concerned about writing has been around issues of cellular agriculture and you know, lab-grown meat and so forth. And given that you've given a particular trajectory of the growth of the meat industry, you know, in many ways, cellular agriculture and its adoption at a large scale is still an entirely speculative thing. But how do you see that? What do you see as the potentials for transformation along this history?
Yeah, I mean, I say that with recognition, of course, that Tufts is at the very center of this field of synthetic biology, that the cellular agriculture lab is here based at Tufts and is doing really interesting work along with the Good and Food Institute. And you know, I'm something of a pessimist and a cynic by nature. Like that's my general go-to about like the nature of the world is to be somewhat dour and always see the dark shades. So it's unusual that I get excited about something. And I'm guardedly optimistic about cultivated agriculture. In part because so much of the skepticism and criticism of it that we've read a lot in the last 10 years has proven to be false, like constant sort of invocations of impossible technical hurdles that in fact were not impossible technical hurdles. And these various things make me strongly make me suspect that like the very, very hardcore skeptics of it are indeed probably too pessimistic. Whether or not that bears out in terms of a large scale transformation of the food system, either here in the United States or globally, is a much bigger question. But the ultimate upside from my perspective is, in some senses, to be able to decouple what I think is the effectively and viscerally powerful pleasure of animal proteins from our sort of like normative relations with animals. I mean, that's the dream. I don't know that we would ever get to that point, although certainly some of the people who are funding it do dream that it might one day go in that direction. But when I think about what it might mean for us to inch our way out of this sort of like culture of meat, which is really how I see the world that we live in, I see this as a kind of promising technical possibility to be able to separate what are really core and key and emotionally powerful attachments that people may have to meat and sort of switching it into a different system of energy conversions, a different kind of metabolic economy. There's also a question in the back.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful. I have a question about, or I have kind of two questions, but the first one is about the geography of this story. So I was really fascinated when you said that, you know, meat production was the way to make use of the West. And then I'm also interested in the way this is seems to be a New England story, New Hampshire and Massachusetts with Goodale. So I don't know if there's a way to just say more about, you know, the geography of this story. And then the other, I kind of just wanted to hear a little bit more about this idea where you're going in the end with the human mental illness and chicken distress and, the different paper, I mean, that this was written on. I'd just love to hear a little bit more about that mystery as you're encountering it or unraveling it. Thanks.
Yeah, so the geography of it, it certainly is the case that Goodale is like a New Englander and he spends his entire life more or less in New England. Mount Hope Farm is influential insofar as a lot of its insights with regards to dairy are widely adopted well outside of New England. Probably its most profound influence is that Mount Hope, and through Goodale himself, is sort of where the genetic engineering upside of artificial insemination is fully articulated. So it begins there in collaboration and cooperation with Cornell. Prentice's son is a guy by the name of Rockefeller Prentice. He founds an organization, or a company, I should say, called American Breeders Service, or ABS, which is the world's leading semen retailer, or was for a while. I don't know if they still are, but they were for a very long period of time. And Goodale is involved in sort of convincing Prentice that artificial insemination allows genetic transformation of livestock, particularly dairy livestock. Really, by 1960, the American dairy industry at a national level is totally transformed by it. So it's difficult to talk about the geography as being specifically like New England. We could talk more about the geography of poultry, which is quite complicated and is now largely sort of centered in the American South. But that wasn't the case in the early 20th century. As for the second, I think the point that I'm trying to make there is that Goodale had some kind of attachment and identification with the animals that he studied. And I don't understand the contours of it, and I don't understand the emotional maelstorms of it. I don't want to suggest, for example, that he clinically been diagnosed with schizophrenia. I certainly don't know that that's the case. I do know that he struggled in some way with some kind of emotional or mental turmoil, and that he cathected on the animals that he was studying vis-a-vis that turmoil. I think that this is part of what I'm trying to get at in how I was answering Alex's question, is that we often think that because livestock breeding is an ecology of control, that we are always in the position of controlling what we take from animals. The story we inherit is a story of exploitation and extraction, right? So we're in control, and we get to decide what we take from animals and what we don't. There's one way of reading Goodale's career that is very much about that is about figuring out how to regiment and control animal breeding, and specifically poultry. And the thing that I'm trying to show there is that that control is illusory. There's always a spillover. We can't segregate these things. We can't hold them apart. And they come back in haunting ways, in surprising ways. And it's a kind of, I suppose, call for historians, specifically historians of science, perhaps, to be more aware of that, to be more sensitive to it as a reality of archival work.
Speaking of historians of science, we have a question online from Harvard History of Science PhD student Oliver Lazarus. There's many critical swinologists around amongst us today. And the question is, to what extent was Goodale's understanding his experiments in racial terms and its applicability to humans as well?
Yeah, okay, this is a very difficult question to answer, in part because the terms breed and race tended to be used more or less interchangeably, certainly in animal science circles in the early 20th century, but more broadly in American culture as well. One way of talking about this would be that the concept of breed emerges from a very similar sort of understanding of heritability as 19th century articulations of race, and certainly race science. In fact, Prentice and Goodale wound up being extremely critical of pure breeding, which for people who know anything about like livestock breeding, if you hear people talking about like heritage breeds and purebred this or that, purebred Cheshire, or, like a purebred Tamworth or something like that. These concepts of breed emerge realistically at the earliest in the 18th century, but mostly in the context of the United States over the course of the 19th century. And so Goodale and Prentice are basically levying a critique of these categories of breed by saying that they happen to be the arbitrary phenotypical traits of various collections of different like cow, pig, and chicken populations as we discovered them like in the 19th century. The thing that I think is very interesting about this is that it's basically it's an identical critique that people were making of race science. A very similar sort of argument about the artificiality and constructed nature of race. Not to say that phenotypical differences weren't biological, certainly people were arguing that they were, but the concept of itself was that it took this sort of like cluster of traits and it packaged them together. At the same time, I don't think that Goodale gets away from racialization. And I don't think that Goodale would suggest, for example, I don't think we can sort of like reformat him as part of like an anti-racist project. I think he's part of a rethinking of how race operates. And he's doing a lot of the sort of like intellectual work that is a precursor to what we might describe as a genetic encoding of race or a racialization of genetics. And I suppose I could talk more about that in depth, but it's a little bit far afield at this moment.
We got, sorry, I'm done here. We got one last question online, brief. It's from Morgan Owens. Do you think that the idea of certain masculine traits that chickens have that should be bred being transferred onto human reproduction, like in the eugenics conference, do you think that this contributed to ideas of toxic masculinity and a rigid definition of manhood in our society?
Well, I'm a little hesitant to answer that. Like there might be a clear like pass through to it. I'm a little hesitant to go there. For starters, because I mean, certainly for Goodale, he's like critical of that. He's like your secondary sex characteristics don't tell you anything about like your capacity to pass on traits, like your primary sex characteristics. He's saying those things that you actually come up with like very skewed understandings of sex if you operate from that perspective. That said, pure breeding certainly contributed quite extensively to 19th century and early 20th century conceptions of masculinity. I write about this in my other work, but like pig farmers were obsessed with the masculinity of their boars. They would rhapsodize about their masculine brows, about their aggressive, sturdy constitutions. You didn't want like a boar that was too wan and too femmy, I suppose would be one way of putting it. You wanted one that was like stout and aggressive and was going to go about mating with the sows as it wanted. And they were clearly also like thinking about themselves. As I said, I write about this in another article. There's this huge panic amongst Berkshire pig breeders where they worry that Berkshire pigs, the breed, are entering into what they term a race suicide. And it's clearly a whole discourse about their own anxieties about white masculinity. So there are through lines, and I would say that it contributes probably that the culture of livestock breeding is not one that I would segregate or separate from general sorts of cultural norms around masculinity.